So, evaluation of the localization theory. We're continuing on. I have changed from previous years. We're now continuing to use the spec structure. So, supporting evidence, practical applications, evaluation of methodology, and contrast to alternatives, which should make your life a little bit easier than having to memorise off by heart hundreds of different evaluation points with no prompts whatsoever. So just think back to those poor unfortunate souls from previous years who had to struggle through memorising all different ones without any kind of way of prompting them. So supporting evidence for localisation, then we have Peterson, who conducted some research in 1988, who used brain scans, and he found that in brain scans, when participants were doing a listening task, that Wernicke's area lit up, whereas when they were reading out loud, Broca's area lit up. And of course then you need to, in your P points, when you structure those, because you haven't escaped those, we're still going to use those. When you use them, you need to discuss what that indicates and link it back to localization. Why is it significant that when in a brain scan, one area is active when a certain task is happening and another area is active when another task is happening? Why does that support the localization theory? However, something to counter that slightly, the point about localization, so some opposing evidence essentially of localization, is a man with a fabulous name, well I assume it's a man, might be a lady, Dronkers, who scanned Tan's brain. So they'd saved his brain, so in 2007 he had a scan of it, and he found that whilst there was damage on in Broca's area, there were other areas of the brain that were also damaged as well. So we cannot be confident of cause and effect because of course there's extraneous variables. So can we confidently state that only that one, the person who localization, the theory was developed on, one of the key case studies, we can't actually be confident that it was just one area of the brain, and there were other areas to consider that might be having that effect on speech production as well. It's not exclusively one part. So what impact does that have on localization? Next one, practical applications, again starts with a piece of research. So we've got Doherty, who conducted cingulotomies on OCD patients, so it's where a lesioned a part of the brain, and they found that in one third of the sample, patients experienced a reduction in their symptoms to a more a healthier level, or a more manageable level, and then you need to reflect on what that might mean. So the fact that a part of the brain was damaged and therefore a certain behaviour that was being displayed was then reduced in some patients obviously indicates something about localization. However, it was only 1/3 of patients, it wasn't 100%, so can we balance it out? But ultimately you could argue there are practical applications, the practical application of quite extreme but of neurosurgery, so of brain surgery, that could improve people's lives and reduce people's experience of symptoms from mental health needs. So again, with that one, you would still structure practical applications in the same way. So you'd say strength is there are practical applications. For example, Doherty found this. So you've got a bit more to talk about there. And then why is it a good thing that we have practical applications? However, what is a problem with Doherty's practical application? Doesn't apply to everybody. People experience individual differences, participant variables that might impact upon that, the effectiveness of that treatment. And then as always, E, we've got evaluation of methodology. A lot of the research that's conducted into localization is on people such as OCD patients, or we had TAN. So generally they are people who have previously already experienced brain damage, and we're comparing the functioning of those people with with people who haven't had that brain damage and don't and have that sort of typical brain, those typical functions, and so they haven't been randomly allocated. And of course you know loads about quasi or quasi experiments, so you could really bring that in, but the key thing is at the end you must link it back to the impact on localization. Why does it matter that there is flawed methodology that supports the theory? What is the impact of that? Now that you're in the second year, that evaluation needs to become much more detailed. And then we've got contrast to alternatives. So we've got potentiality theory, working on the pronunciation of that one. So that is the idea that certain tasks are localized within the brain, and of course we've identified a few of them earlier in the video. However, it also believes that the higher and more complex the cognitive functioning, the more parts of the brain are required to support and manage that cognitive functioning. So plasticity is one you can remember and come back to as an example, but a better example would be a piece of research by Lashley. He looked at rats running a maze, and how long it took them to learn to run a maze based on what part of the brain was damaged, how much of the brain was damaged. So he randomly went around damaging different, well, not randomly, I imagine it was carefully noted down, but essentially would just damage a part of the brain. Does that impact the rat's ability to learn to run a maze? No, let's damage a little bit more. So he damaged different parts in different amount, between 10 and 50% of the brain, and shockingly enough still found that rats were able to learn to run a maze. So there was no set part of the brain that was involved in learning, in the learning process, and that is a higher level cognitive function. So that would suggest not to go against localization's assumptions about how the brain works. So of course calling into question the validity of the theory to be able to explain everything. And then another contrast to another alternative, you also have, so linking in with plasticity, the idea of plasticity, they suggest that a certain part of the brain, in localization of course, a certain part of the brain affects a certain, controls a certain function. With plasticity, it's the idea that if that part of the brain gets damaged, and this has been shown in examples like Gabby Gifford, and that is Gabby Gifford, that those functions, so for example she was, and it's quite an interesting video to watch, she was a politician in America, she was shot and part of her brain was damaged, so she wasn't able to produce speech, or she produced nonsense speech or repetitive speech. For example, I'm pretty sure in this video she talks about how she could only say the word chicken repeatedly. However, with therapy, with rehabilitation, her language comprehension and production, in key the production, Broca's area, moved into a different part of her brain, to a healthy part of her brain. They redirected the information, so a different part of her brain was able to allow her to produce speech still. So of course, with the localization, once that part of the brain is damaged, done forever, whereas the theory of plasticity suggests that that functioning in the brain, if that part of the brain is damaged, that function can be moved to elsewhere. And you can also, later on we do look at plasticity, and you can use Gabby Gifford as an example, so she's quite a good one. Potentiality theory is a really, really good one to use, because you could talk about it in lots of detail, but it's good to store Gabby Gifford in the back of your mind and bring her back out in plasticity. Okay, and that is the end of the evaluations for the localization theory.